Hello and welcome to another episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. We are very lucky to be joined by nutritionist Katrina Borg. Katrina, do you want to give us a bit of background about you and who you are and what you do?
Yeah, I would love to. So I'm the lead nutritionist over at Married to My Macros, and we work primarily in performance-based nutrition with athletes of a variety of backgrounds, Olympic weightlifters, endurance athletes, team sport athletes, and then kind of everyone in between, whether or not they have real athletic ambitions or just want to improve their health and fitness. I come from an Olympic weightlifting and CrossFit background myself, and that's where I've competed historically. But really kind of branching out and starting to work with fighters and people in different domains. So recently completed my master's in nutrition and human performance and kind of...
Where did you do that?
In Logan University out of the States.
Okay, cool.
So... which I moved from Canada down to Australia in the middle of that, so that was an excellent choice.
Yeah.
And did my thesis on weight cuts in sports.
Interesting.
And,
Okay. So I think that'll sort of lead us into some interesting areas.
Definitely. So I kind of looked at fighting and weight cuts within fighting and what we can learn from that and take to Olympic weightlifting and what we absolutely cannot.
We'll go into that. What are the main things that you did find?
So with fighters, and it depends completely on the combat sport.
Yeah, they're generally pretty notorious for trying to do crazy weight cuts.
Massive weight cuts, massive.
Like when you say massive, for the uninitiated, how much are these people trying to drop and how quickly are they dropping it?
We're talking like 20 kilos, 10 to 20 kilos. And
over how long?
You'd see like a chronic stage where you'd look at like maybe an 8 to 12 week period where they're dropping kind of maybe 5 to 10 kilos of that, and then you're talking 10 plus kilos in the final week.
Yeah, okay. And
so
like,
crazy,
let's break that into two parts then, because like in that initial period when, one, it's a bit interesting to say like you've got an athlete who they compete say 75 kilos.
Yeah.
They're walking around at 95, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
All right. And is that on purpose or they're just being like pretty loose with their diet?
I think it's a combination. I think culturally there's such an ingrained culture of doing these massive cuts and walking around at a higher weight thinking that you're going to get more athletic performance from being able to train at that weight. But then I also think there's the component of you're cutting so much weight and so aggressively and you're so restrictive for so long that you have these huge blowouts on the other end. So a lot of disorder.
Yeah, I noticed like I watch a little bit of say UFC, and the one that I noticed recently that's becoming popular is a guy named Paddy Pimblett.
Yeah.
And he blows up like a balloon, and he already has a bit of a fat face, so it's a little bit interesting, but he just blows up and you think like, okay, why are you going so far away from, because I'm sure Jack's told you my background as a coach as well. The thought that I would have is not so much that there's an issue with putting on the weight, but it creates a secondary problem when you're trying to get your performance level, say for the major competition, for them it's a fight, of not only are you worried about your performance, but you're also worried about trying to get your weight to a reasonable level.
You're competing twice.
Yes.
Yeah.
You're setting two different competitions for yourself, which to me makes absolutely no sense.
And especially in combat sports where the risk of injury, whether that be head injury or musculoskeletal trauma, is so high. You talk about the requirements to get down in that cut phase, you increase your risk of injury so much more. He's a great example because I think he fights at like 145 and then within a week of his fight he's up to 205.
Like, within a week.
Within a week. Yeah, and he posts these dumb videos of him just going to like fast food places and ordering the whole menu and like trying to eat everything.
Because the other thing I think of then too is not just from a performance standpoint, but during training, like your ability to actually perform at a high level in training and recover
is
particularly when your diet's is trash.
Yeah, massively.
It depends. I guess you can, if you're walking around at that, you might not necessarily be eating trash, but it seems like a lot of them do.
It's probably early in camp starting to get that weight down, right? But he's opened up recently and talked about his struggles with disordered eating, admitting that he definitely has some sort of an eating disorder, he says. It's, no kidding, right? Yeah. And that's from that huge binge restrict. You do that 3 or 4 times a year.
That's interesting. So do they... Going based on what you're sort of observing in your thesis type stuff, are they, in that first part, are they dieting more in a conventional manner with calorie like management and making sure they're trying to eat healthier and
definitely like
hydration, all those kind of things?
Really cleaning up the food, getting into like what I would consider to be a very hypocaloric range for my athletes, which I would already consider to be a massive cut.
Yeah.
But then when you look at what they
do, they're already doing it in a very dramatic calorie deficit.
Yeah, you could have like a 80 kilo male, working off like a 1700 cal intake for well over a month, and we're talking training 3, 4, 5, 6 hours a day.
Yeah. Okay. Right? Okay. And then if that's not aggressive enough, what's happening in that last week or two?
So the last week is more about fluid management and manipulation as opposed to like fat loss. Mm-hmm. And definitely you're going to manage your food, you're going to manage your fiber intake, your total cal intake, and all of those things will help you drop scale weight, not necessarily body weight. You're probably doing a water load, which is going to help you lose maybe 1 kilo, 2 kilos. And then the last 48 to 72 hours, it's going to be a lot of sauna. Sweaty cardio is probably not a huge go-to anymore. Tons of hot water baths, stuff like that.
And all right, so
they have 24 plus hours to recover.
Yeah. So there's 2 questions I have. One is, what damage comes out of doing those dramatic cuts? I've heard that it can cause, particularly with the water loading and then cutting, like there can be massive long-term kidney problems, right? Which I don't understand, but you might be able to elucidate whether that's true or not. The second one is, what happens with performance, and has there been reasonable measures into the performance decrement that you have from doing something like that with a 24-hour refueling? Because I know that, like, as a fan of boxing and UFC, boxing more so, if people have really dramatic weight cuts and they struggle to make weight, getting knocked out becomes really easy, because it seems like their dehydration has a massive effect on their, how strong their chin seems to be.
Yeah, massive. So when you think about like how important water is for the brain and how much water the brain actually contains, it's not possible. And so all of the studies that have been done on kind of like 10 kilo losses or less in that last half a week, I would say, right? Yeah. And what we see is anecdotally, especially in the UFC, you see bigger than that, right?
Yeah, but if you stuck with that, because I would say that's probably maybe a median.
An average, yeah. Massive risk for knockouts. You cannot rehydrate in 24 hours the amount of like a 10 kilo
What
fluid
does the
loss.
evidence suggest of how long that does take, or is it individual?
Individual, for sure. 36 to 48 hours.
Okay,
and so sometimes you might have a little bit of a longer fight interval and you might get a little bit closer.
Is that so, like, obviously people aren't cutting that much for other events, but is that a general guide for someone who's, say, doing sport in a very hot environment and you've got a multi-day competition? Are you then instructing them about, like, okay, one day of really heavy competition may be enough to deplete you for at least 24 hours, maybe longer?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my go with that would be planning for that competition, planning for the environment of that competition, and trying not to let that level of dehydration occur. Yeah. Right, so we know that you've got like a 2% drop in hydration status can equate to like a 25% decrease in performance. And so depending on what the sport is, I have some pretty time managed guidelines for fluid and electrolyte intake.
All right, correct me, because I heard that it's not necessarily that dramatic in, like, it came out of the research, and you would know better than me, so correct me, but the stuff looking at, like, Tim Noakes published Waterlogged eventually, but the stuff that happened where they were overhydrating people in, say, like, and everyday people in marathons, people were dying. Yeah, because they were basically causing
hyponatremia.
Yeah.
So we're talking about overhydrating with plain water, largely, and then also volumes in excess of like 1 liter an hour.
Yeah.
That's where the 2 biggest issues.
Yeah, I'm not talking about that. So, but the discussion came out of, because there was always this thought that if you became even 1%, 2% dehydrated, your performance decrement was quite significant.
But the other side of the coin is true too.
But I'm asking, like, is that actually the case, or what the evidence? Where is the evidence with that? Because he kind of tried to argue, well, that's not necessarily the case. Therefore, like, we don't need to, drink to thirst. Don't worry about that kind of thing.
It depends, like everything, right? Yeah. It depends on the sport. It depends on, like, the primary muscle fibers that are going to be used. It depends on the gender. It depends on the training adaptations. How used to training dehydrated is the person. Did you take someone out of their typical training environment, put them in a very hot environment that they're not used to?
Yeah. Is there, like, we see heat acclimatization is very real, right? Is it a similar thing to like dehydration, almost competition and performance, or is it you never quite adapt to it?
I think that you definitely can adapt to it, but it's so individual, and that's the problem, right? And if you look at sweat rates between individuals,
that varies a lot, doesn't it?
Massive, and dependent on the sport, you might have massive variation within that as well. Mm-hmm. So I think a big part of the problem has come with like blanket recommendations, and that's where the drink to thirst recommendation has come. Unfortunately, with drink to thirst, like you probably don't have much of a thirst mechanism until you're about 1 to 2% there. Mm-hmm. And then what's the nature of your sport? Can you drink like as needed? Do you have a nervous belly? Can you manage that? Are you already experiencing some dehydration related electrolyte shifts? Mm-hmm. It gets really complicated. So I always try and go in with a plan based on that athlete's training. Mm-hmm. And it is a little bit hope for the best, right? But I think that if you go in with a plan, as opposed to no plan, where most athletes are so laser focused on what they're doing, comes to the end of the day and they're like, oh, I've had a bottle of water in 40-degree heat, you know? You're like, okay, well, yeah, we're going to take 24 hours to recover from that.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Putting aside some of the variables you talked about with hydration, just as a general rule, do you think the idea of drinking to thirst is inaccurate? Because like the way I look at it, like I know a lot of people who say spend time with, say, hunter-gatherer societies. They say that I hardly ever see them drinking water. Yeah. They obviously do drink water, but it's nothing like some of the recommendations that we see today of you should be sipping water all day.
Yeah, I mean, again, I would say it depends on the individual, and probably better than drink to thirst would be drink to urine color.
Yeah, sure.
Right? Drinking to like a pale yellow urine, which might be achieved very easily in to thirst for someone, or like I'm a camel, I could easily have my coffee and not touch water for the rest of the day and feel totally fine with that. If I drink to achieve like that really pale straw colored urine, my performance goes massively through the roof. I can tell you every single time I've done a water load for my sport, I've like hit PRs in what's supposed to be like my deload week leading in. That's just feel like fire. So which probably goes to show that like a little hydration during training could probably go a long way. So I think that drink to urine color is probably better than drink to thirst.
And I think the big thing with that, Jack, too, is like I always think about people. There's a very big difference between like optimization and like survival, or even health. Like
adequate intake versus optimize.
Yeah, they're very different. You know, like totally. We spoke about obviously in discussion recently about. I think we spoke about it, but like things like fasting, for instance, right? Like fasting, there's lots of evidence suggesting that it may actually extend longevity or low caloric intake over a lifetime, at least in animal models, right? But you're sure as shit not going to do that as an athlete. Like it's a real dumb way to train and perform because it's not optimizing your function. And that's the interesting thing about looking at it. It was in that book that you recommended me. Something like, was it Eat Like the Animals or something?
Eat Like Animals, yeah, isn't it? Yeah. Eat Like the Animals.
Yeah. Yes. Anyway, in that book, they talk about the concept of like, you can eat in a way that really optimizes your reproductive function, which is by eating like a higher protein intake. And actually, it's like really good for you in the short term if you're trying to maximize your evolutionary aim, which is to reproduce. But your long-term health is compromised by doing that, like higher caloric intake, more protein intake, all these things. It optimizes things like gonadal function and all those kind of things. But you're probably going to die earlier, you know. And it had, like, I started talking about that. I did concept around like the telomere lengths and stuff was shortening quicker if you were eating that higher, like protein diet versus eating something that's much lower in protein and much more plant-based. You probably live a lot longer, but is your reproductive function optimized as much? Maybe not.
But then also, how do you feel in the meantime?
Well, we spoke about it, like, we sort of laughed about it and said, like, you're here for a good time, not a long time.
Well, it's also probably one of the things though too, like on that example of the separation between perhaps what you see happening at a physiological level versus what's happening at an epidemiological level, because there are plenty of studies showing that high protein diets long term don't reduce longevity.
Yeah,
so
look,
then there's
I don't even know the science well enough, and Katrina will probably correct us on both of those accounts, but it's one of those things of like, I think there's a very big difference between even what's optimal for health and what's optimal for performance. They're not always the same thing. And I think
Well-
we spoke about this concept when we spoke about like even performance, where say with training, once you get to a certain level of physical training, there's a divergence between health
Absolutely.
and sporting performance, for instance. Like at a certain level, doing sport at that level is actually damaging to your body.
Particularly
right?
when you need to apply a certain amount of stressor to get an adaptation to occur.
And I think it's the same with with nutritional. I know
Competition day nutrition and day-to-day nutrition or long-term health nutrition are completely different beasts.
But it's actually, that's probably a good segue.
Sorry, we just hijacked.
No, I like it.
That's a good segue because it's something I often think about too when I think people often forget about the basic recommendations about nutrient intake, specifically micronutrient intake.
Okay, actually, can we ask this question? Because
Sure.
Go
I want someone who's much smarter than me on this to actually
By
tell
all
me like what they
means.
think and give me a reasonable answer that's not just like some like one-liner. Jack and I always talk about this concept of calories in versus calories out,
Yep.
and how it's overly reductionistic,
Yep.
and it discounts the idea of micronutrient intake particularly.
Yep.
And not to mention the hormonal response from certain...
Well, yeah, that's obviously closely related.
Yeah.
But you get into arguments usually with keyboard warriors, right?
Yeah.
Or bro science idiots that all that matters is calories in versus calories out, right? Also, actually, and this would be interesting to get your take on, I've actually even had at a minor level disagreements with dietitians about this kind of stuff. And to me,
Some of the athletes you work with.
I get frustrated because they'll say, well, it doesn't matter where those calories are coming from as long as the macronutrient is the
No.
right one.
No.
And, and the
Of course
calories...
it matters, yeah.
And I remember, because I'll give you an example. Once a dietitian gave an athlete that I was coaching like a pre-packaged protein
Yeah.
supplement. I'm not going to say what it was or whatever, but I was just like, don't drink that shit. It's absolute
Yeah.
bullshit. Like you look at it, it's got 700 fucking ingredients.
Do you know what
in it.
any of those things
Yeah.
are?
And I was like, don't drink that.
With
And
some things that look like they're from a chemistry lab. In
yeah,
terms of
I was just like,
the length
why
of
would you
the-
drink? It's clearly not healthy for you, right?
So I think like we need to... Calories in, calories out is like the base layer of the pyramid.
And that's how I
right?
see
Like that
it.
is the most important thing when you're talking about sport
yeah.
and athletes is like, do we have that box checked off? Are we in the right place there? If we need to be in a deficit, if we need to be in a surplus, if we need to be at maintenance, do we have that correct? Yes? Okay, let's look at our macronutrient intake. Do we have appropriate ratios there? Are we accounting for and giving you an appropriate amount of protein per your body size? Are we giving you appropriate number of carbs per your activity? Do we have enough fats in there to optimize hormonal function? Check that box. Cool. Next thing up is the micros. And it's super important. You should always be working up the pyramid, but you're majoring in the minors if you're talking about someone's like selenium intake if they're in a deficit.
Yeah,
right?
that's pointless at that stage. Yeah.
Yeah, you've got to move through the structure, and with some athletes, it can take years just to get them on board with cal intake.
Yeah.
With some, I always say to my clients when I'm bringing them on and they're wanting to say like a food logging, like MFP or something, I'm like, yeah, that's fine. I need you to export your info, send it through in CSV, and I can kind of analyze your micros and your macros. You also need to give me access to overview your diary because you might hit your macros spot on perfect by eating a pizza and 4 scoops of protein powder. Doesn't count, right? Like that's not going to get us to achieve your goals. So we've got to see the what that makes that up as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, no.
Okay, the calories thing I think jumps into an area that I think is becoming much more commonly discussed. Whether it's understood or not, I don't know, but it's discussed is the area of REDS or relative energy deficiency syndrome.
Yep.
Can you maybe I think for the people who don't know, give a little bit of an understanding of what that is? And at least from my end, I want to kind of know is like how much nutrition plays in that and how much the other areas of health play in that. Because I'll give you my completely uneducated opinion, which is that there's too much weight put on something like the calorie side of it as for the energy deficiency, and I think it's more of an interplay of lots of things.
I agree and disagree. So relative energy deficiency in sport is essentially has kind of arisen out of the female athlete triad,
yeah.
right? Which was a starting place for us, which looked at this huge issue within female athletes, say someone like a gymnast, for example, where we saw disordered eating patterns, we saw menstrual irregularities, and we saw stress fractures. And that was kind of that triad that was coming out, which is a great starting point in looking at issues within sport. Completely ignored 50% of the population, if not more, right? By not recognizing that the exact same thing occurs in men. Of course, they don't have the menstrual irregularities, but they certainly have hormonal irregularities and alterations to their testosterone. And it eventually is an issue of calories in, calories out, because it's a low energy availability issue. You're not eating enough to support the work that you do.
I'm not arguing that.
Right?
I'm arguing, for instance, that sometimes even when those are met, the other issues persist.
Yeah.
And
so you have low nutrient availability in the context of appropriate caloric intake.
Yeah. So like I've had issues in the past where, as I said to you, working with different athletes, they're clearly eating enough calories, and even the macronutrients might be reasonable, but the simplistic view is, well, they just need to eat more. And my argument has been, well, they're eating enough. We need to work out what combinations, say, of micronutrients are missing, because they're clearly still showing some form of hormonal disturbance or other factors that's causing their health to not actually be optimized in this environment.
And the great example of that would be the athlete that is being told they need to eat more, and they need to eat more, and they need to eat more. And I can't eat 5,000 calories a day of whole foods, so now I'm resorting to processed foods, and I'm having a lot of the intake come from that. And so I think that's why you see a very slow recovery in a lot of RED-S cases, is because, yes, you've addressed the caloric issue, but you've got this micronutrient issue.
Yep.
Another issue that I see in a lot of RED-S cases is we'll start with low energy availability.
Yep.
They'll go see a practitioner who shouldn't be treating them, and this is like not harping on doctors, not harping on the medical field, but it's not their area of expertise. They'll go in with digestive complaints, right? Because that's a huge issue. You think about, like, if we talk about ancestrally, where we came from, and what's the primary function that the body is always going to prioritize to ensure survival of the individual, not the species, movement, right? We need to move to escape our predators. We need to move to get food. So it's not reproduction necessarily, it's movement. And so where we start kind of pulling back is the reproductive system, the digestive system, things like that. So you see a lot of people come in with digestive issues, lots of bloating, nausea, abdominal distension, diarrhea, constipation, those sorts of things. They go to the doctor, they have all these complaints. On the surface, you have a very healthy individual, a very active individual. They seem to be eating lots. It's IBS. Here's a list of foods you should restrict, right? And so now you've got someone who's potentially relying on a high processed food intake, who's now being given a list of whole foods that they need to restrict because these could be trigger foods. Yeah. And now you've got this micronutrient issue gets extrapolated even further, right? When it's like the answer wasn't to restrict foods, it was to look at that diet and make sure that it's complete and we are addressing all of those micronutrient intake values. Yeah. So I think that that's a huge issue with RED-S that gets really misinterpreted and really misunderstood, and that's where we can be much better.
In terms of, like, I had an interesting discussion with an athlete, not my athlete, but an athlete who had been working very closely with the sports nutritionist through their training year, because leading up to the major competitions, they always lost their period. Yeah.
Not normal, should never be normal, should never be accepted.
And so she was like, we're trying to work on that. Yeah. But actually, like, she said it was interesting, like, she thinks that there's a very big factor related to stress in that. Yeah. Because they found all through her training year, they optimized everything, all the blood tests were coming back really good, all the levels of most things had improved from where they started, yet she got within a month of that major comp and her period disappeared, and it came back about a month after the comp. Yeah. And was having a discussion with the nutritionist and saying, like, is this just the way my system reacts to that kind of level of stress, or is there something that we need to do differently to what we did? And obviously that was the first time that they'd worked with that practitioner, so they're like, okay, maybe we'll try a few other things. But based on your experience, like, is that something that does
Yes. So
that can affect it, that is not necessarily just related to that food side of it.
yeah, and I would have a much higher tolerance level for one missed cycle at the time of a high stress event than I would for an ongoing pattern.
Yes, yeah, of course.
It's still something I would want to investigate. It's still something I would want to look at, like, as we get closer to that, are you getting stressed and intake is dropping, or we're resorting to different foods? What else is going on there? There's still a lot of questions. But particularly for my weightlifters who have to make weight, they can be bang on with their cycle, like every day, perfect, right? Exactly 28 days. And if competition happens to fall on that day, it is so common to see that cycle shift by a couple days. Or to see something like I don't see it typically where we skip the cycle entirely, but it does happen. So
it's interesting actually how the body prepares accordingly, where psychologically you're performing in a week, so the menstrual cycle may shift a few days to actually accommodate that.
Wild. Yeah. I'm like, can we shift it a few days earlier so that we get this like positive weight effect?
Well, it's a good example though too of how your psychology affects your physiology, because that's the other thing I think of too. If someone is actually getting that stress where they're missing their period, do they actually need to address some of the psychological or emotional components associated with how they perceive their performance?
Absolutely.
Like there's such a thing as too much stress.
Yeah. Do we need to be working with like a mindset coach or someone that specializes in that area? Would that be beneficial? Would that impact things?
One question I wanted to ask from before is people cutting weight. There's an issue that you have on your metabolism. I actually know there's been an interesting example of this is looking at the Biggest Loser competition, and they've done studies of looking at what happens to Biggest Loser contestants 12 months later, and not surprisingly a lot of them regain the weight that they lost during the competition,
and then some,
and then some, but more importantly their resting metabolic rate is also lowered quite significantly, so there's actually a change in their ability to have like anabolic response. Do you see that yourself with a lot of people, a lot of athletes who cut regularly and therefore have issues going through that cut?
Yes and no. With my weightlifters, not as much. Sorry. Because weightlifting has a 2-hour weigh into competition interval, you cannot do a 10 kilo cut.
Yeah, of course.
Right? We're talking 2 kilos, right? And so what we need to do to get that client into that cut is not going to dampen their metabolic response nearly as much, and is not going to have nearly as much kind of long-term hypothalamic effect. It definitely still has some, and you definitely see with bigger cuts, with more frequent cuts, that over time those cuts become harder and harder. Sometimes that's because the athlete's also adding muscle mass to their frame, and we need to consider whether this is the right weight class for you still, but definitely there can be ongoing damage. With fighters, way more pronounced, way more. I have a fighter actually today who is competing right now, and she came to me after an atrocious cut, terrible, lost her period, really sick, and I said, okay, well, let's see where we're at, let's rebuild you, let's see what we can do. About a month and a half after a comp, I said, I don't think we can do this, I need you to go to the doctor, I need all this stuff done, like I don't think we can make this. Came back, all her blood work came back sort of acceptable, and
like on the lower end,
like TSH, still normal range, but higher than I'd like to see, things like that. And so I kind of advised against it. She said, no, I'm doing it, I have to do it, I can't pull out. And I had a huge conversation with my husband, who's my business partner, about this, because I said I want to fire her as a client, essentially. Like this is kind of at my ethical limit of what I'll do. And he has a very different perspective to me. He's like, okay. He's like, well, you can do that. He's like, and what's she going to do? She's going to put herself on 500 calories a day for the next month. She's going to make weight at all costs. She's going to do everything wrong with her fluid intake, with her sodium intake. She's going to potentially end up in the hospital with kidney damage or potentially seizuring. And she's going to have massive health issues on the other side. He's like, right now you have an athlete who agrees that she has to do some long-term rebuilding after this fight. He's like, so you can push your ethical limits a little and get her in and have her on your side and willing to do the things that you think she needs to do after, or you can cut her off and hope that she makes it through okay. I was like, that feels like you've got a gun to my head a little bit, right? Anyways, we ended up getting her through. She made weight this morning. She was on a higher intake even in her last 24 hours than she was on in her previous cut for the month leading in. But we're going to have some stuff to deal with for sure, because that metabolic rate has just gone into the toilet. So that's going to be months to years of recovery. So
yeah, how do you deal with that then? Particularly because I'm assuming she's going to be continue competing. It's not her last.
Yeah, we've
fight.
Had an agreement about she won't be fighting again this year.
Yeah, okay.
And we'll kind of look at that schedule and look at her recovery and see what that looks like. But it's a tough one. And like I said, ethically, it's fighters I find very difficult to work with, because for me, it's pushing the bounds of what I'm comfortable with.
I was going to say, why does it actually take so long to restore normal physiology or normal metabolism?
Well, you've got that dampened metabolic rate. That takes time to rebuild, and you've got to super slowly rebuild it. We're talking 50 cal increases a week, because otherwise you're going to see this huge weight gain, which maybe isn't physiologically the worst thing for the client, but they're going to perceive it as such.
Psychologically,
and then,
they'll see it as terrible.
you've got to have them on board, right? So I can't have them gain a ton of weight. I need them on my side. So you've got to do super slow rebuild. And even with the metabolic rate improving, you've got hormonal alterations. You've got pituitary and hypothalamus unhappy, cranking out who knows what sort of signals. FSH, LSH going nuts. Your estrogen, testosterone is dampened, and that can take ages to recover from.
Is it also associated with significant nutrient loss, whether that's related to, say, you're going to be leaching lots of calcium from your bone, therefore have quite poor bone health, or I also, it's actually a good question to ask you, because I know, for instance, things like B12 status, getting a B12 deficiency, from what I understand, may not be apparent in your blood unless you've actually got a very significant B12 deficiency, because your body's quite good at storing it.
Nothing is apparent in your blood until you are sick.
Yeah, okay.
And that's a problem in a lot of the blood work that we use to monitor this. The body is so good at maintaining homeostasis, and especially if we're looking at blood concentrations, right? Urine concentrations might be a little bit more indicative of a long-term status, but we're looking at blood concentrations. You can only survive within a super finite range.
Yeah.
So if you go outside of that range, you are hospitalized sick.
Well, I know that's the case for something like calcium, because calcium basically will never look like it's deficient, because you're going to regulate
100%.
calcium secretion from your bone to maintain normal homeostasis, because if that's down, then you're in all sorts of trouble.
And we're not looking at actual bone stores, right?
No.
We could maybe look at
serum,
a DEXA or something like that, and see kind of what that bone mineral density is looking like. And there's kind of other ways that we can evaluate it, or we see things like stress fractures coming through. But your nutrient stores don't look bad until they're really bad.
So then will you often just look at the more obvious things of one, what's your dietary intake, and is there any indications of potential nutrient deficiency, if we're not beyond, say, caloric deficiency, but then also to their symptoms, are they actually presenting with indications of a B12 deficiency? Or
do we have dry skin? Do we have itchiness? Are we losing, is our hair not only being lost, but is it dry and brittle? What do our nails look like? Are we experiencing a lot of cramping? All of those sorts of things can be helpful. And then I start very simple. Let's look at your diet. What are you eating? Are there any food groups that you cut out? That's probably the easiest one. Right?
So that's actually important then to think about, because if you think that someone has a nutrient deficiency and you say go to the doctor and get some blood tests, that actually may not give you the information you need then, really.
Probably not. And then it gets way more complicated than that too, because you look at a vitamin, a B12 deficiency. Okay, serums come back normal. Do you have genetic mutations that, affect the methylation of different vitamins and nutrients, right? So,
and then all the cofactors associated with everything, like B9 and riboflavin and all those other things are involved in methylation.
So I think it gets so complicated when you're looking for that often we're much better looking at symptoms and treating symptoms. And yes, we'll go get the blood work, but if anything shows up on there, that's That's a big problem. That's not the first sign, right?
Is this something actually, it brings up a good point, because I know, for instance, myself, every now and then I use a chronometer, the app, and like put in what I eat, because I eat pretty consistently, to see, am I actually deficient in anything particular? But I realise most people aren't willing to do that. Most people aren't going to actually think about what they eat, put it in, maybe most ideally weigh it as well to see how much you're actually eating of each. So yeah, how do you go about? I guess that's where you come in.
I mean, I would say most of my athletes are willing to do that, right? So that makes it very easy in that population. Gen pop, maybe a little bit less so. And so if that's the case, it's like, then let's do a couple diaries, right? And I'll put it in. I'll do the diary review. I'll do the numbers. Now, spot picking days doesn't work, right? So ideally look at a longer period of time. But before I do that, I go back to do you cut anything out? And that could be ethical grounds. That could be I don't like it. That could be I don't respond well to lactose, like any of those sort of things.
Is that common now too? Do you have a lot of athletes who do have restrictions in their diet where they avoid eating certain food groups?
I actually think it's less common than when I started practicing like 6 years ago.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like that's things are changing.
I actually think it's getting better.
Yeah.
And maybe that was because 6 years ago we're talking paleo, keto was very big,
there was a lot of these restrictive kind of ideas, and a lot of them started becoming a bit extreme.
Yeah. So I actually think that that's improving. Definitely plant-based diets is one direction where I see a lot of that still. And then people who avoid lactose, gluten, things like that, whether or not they have an actual sensitivity or it's trendy or whatever. Right?
Okay, so we spoke about this a little bit, but I think it's important to sort of go through this now. With people who are on a restrictive diet, what do you think the risks are for them? And are there certain nutrients that you're really going to struggle to get if you are, for whatever reason, restricting what you eat?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it depends on the diet, right? Like a vegan diet is completely different to someone who's restricting, say, gluten or is carb phobic, right? So I'm definitely going to look for different things in there. I recently took on a client who's incredibly carb phobic and has a history of a lot of alcohol use. I'm very concerned about their B vitamin status, right? Because they're going to have a massively low intake of like their B1 in particular, because alcohol is going to impair that absorption. And if they're carb phobic, they're not topping themselves up. So that's definitely going to be something that I look at. For my vegan clients, iron and protein would be obviously like your top two. Calcium's another really big concern, especially in women. But there's a whole host of nutrients I'll look at.
We'll go to the two extremes, right? Because I think one of them's probably less popular than the other. But if you say a vegan, and if we keep it in an athletic population, is it feasible to be a long-term vegan as an athlete? And if it is, like, what kind of things do they need to be really considerate of?
I definitely think it's possible, and it's really going to depend on the individual, because some people really do quite well, and those are the people that also have a very high nutrient intake. When we talk about those cals in, cals out, they're on 3,000, 5,000 cals a day. When you're on a higher nutrient intake, you're able to assimilate a lot of more complete protein sources from all of these different places. If you're an athlete who's cutting weight and is on 1,600 calories a day and you're following a vegan diet, we are going to have massive problems, because there's no way we're going to be able to meet your protein needs, your iron needs, things like that, right? So depends on the athlete. If they've got a high intake and a high carb intake from a diverse array of sources and they're willing to eat a lot of things within that, I do think that even though we're working with much less bioavailable proteins, the overall volume of proteins makes up for that. And so they can absolutely do quite well.
Do you see variability in individual response though too?
Oh, massive, massive.
Because it seems like, I know there's a lot of people who probably more on that sort of carnivore animal based diet.
Even this is a very, very high protein diet. It's probably more in almost like that bodybuilding world.
Because like there's that suggestion that plants have defense chemicals
Yeah.
because they have to protect themselves through chemical warfare as opposed to physical strategies, and that there is certain anti-nutrients within plants that limit your ability to absorb certain nutrients as well. But I imagine that there's going to be a lot of variability in people's gut and probably genetic factors that determine whether someone can actually draw out those nutrients effectively or not.
Yeah, genetic and environmental. Like, what's the status of that gut? How much inflammation have we got going on from X number of factors, whether that's like sports-related stress to like other supplement or alcohol or those sort of uses, right? If you've got a lot of inflammation and a lot of like mucosal damage going on, plus potentially genetic changes, it's going to absolutely impair.
The one area that I did want to get some clarification on is something like collagen intake. It's becoming hugely popular, obviously, in injury healing, and particularly in the area of tendon research. And I think it's going to expand over time.
Yeah.
Our understanding, or at least my understanding, is it's difficult to get unless you are eating plant-based, animal-based.
Yeah.
Is that true?
I think so. I'm curious to see where this field of research goes, because I think I'm personally very unsatisfied with the research as it stands, and the research into supplementation specifically.
Why is that?
I think that there's a lot of potential uses, but I don't think that there's a lot of great studies that show great absorption and use from supplement form.
I think the other thing too is the problem with a lot of supplementations, including collagen, is it's a highly refined food where you're losing a lot of cofactors.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
reality, and it's actually a good thing to discuss with you about supplementation versus the whole food matrix, because let's say, for instance, you're consuming collagen in animal food from like a tough bit of meat which got a bit of tendons, things like that in it. You're not just consuming collagen, but you're consuming all these other compounds when you think about like all the proteoglycans in there and hyaluron.
And what's the interaction with kind of your enzymes as you digest that, right, and break it down, and what does that do to the proteins as well? I think, it's protein in any form, whether we talk about like kind of it's always better in whole food form because of all those cofactors. I'd much rather see someone eat a piece of chicken or a piece of steak than have a scoop of WPI.
Yes.
Right? Because you're missing out on so much of that other good stuff. Now, if we know that your overall protein is going to be low, your overall collagen is going to be low, do we top up with a supplement? Yeah, maybe. But how high can we get that natural intake so that we can make the most use of our food as possible?
Do you also consider the importance for performance, some of the, say, non-essential secondary type of amino acids, whether it be like, say, collagen, say, glycine or proline, but I know there's a lot of things such as like carnosine, carnitine, anserine, taurine, all those factors as well. Do you think they have a really important component to physiology and requirement to consume through diet to optimize performance?
Absolutely, when they're consumed together. But if you consume any of those in isolation, their use is so limited, right? So, it kind of like harkens back to like always in whole food form where possible. Can we spot treat? Maybe. So, I'm not convinced that supplementing with any of those amino acids in isolation does all that much.
So how do you approach supplementation with athletes that you work with? What are the sort of guidelines or principles that you follow to determine whether it is appropriate or not?
So how much can we get from whole foods? That's always my first question. Now with athletes, a lot of the time it's a volume problem, right? Cannot eat anymore, cannot do that. So, okay, in that case, absolutely we're going to top up the remainder, right? With non-athletes, it can also be a volume problem, but for different reasons. Like it's protein aversion. I can't possibly eat more than 1 or 2 meals with like animal-based protein in a day. Okay, well, I'd still rather see you get that adequate intake than not. So let's top it up, but let's see how we can sneak foods in different places. So, I mean, protein's probably like one of the most important and one of the biggest ones. And aside from that, like I'm really basic when it comes to supplementation. I do believe that almost everyone can benefit from an omega-3 supplement. I do believe that almost everyone can benefit from a vitamin D supplement. I'm more than happy to check blood work on that and look at your levels, but I've almost never seen anyone within range unless they're supplementing. And I just think it's like a steroid precursor. That's massive. Beyond that, there's nothing that I would like blanket say the majority of the population needs to be taking or needs to be considering. It's
What
always
about
spot
something
treating.
that has pretty good evidence like creatine?
Yeah, happy to discuss that in kind of each individual athlete. Creatine can be problematic for weight class-based athletes, so we need to look at what your weight response is to that.
Well, this is circling back, 'cause I didn't ask it before, but I'm interested. What's your, like, it sounds like your position with weight class athletes is that they should not necessarily try to go down or stay around that level, like they should be considering always going up.
Yeah, I definitely have a bias.
Yeah, it was interesting because, like, obviously you work with Lydia, she works with us. I have this sense, and this is again just a completely personal opinion, that a lot of our athletes could go down, but they don't actually want to diet hard enough.
Yeah.
What do you think the balance is there with these kind of sports? And obviously, you're taking some of a professional hat with that. I'm taking a completely non-professional hat with that. But it seems interesting to me that, like, there seems to be a culture, say, in weightlifting, everyone just gets pushed up weight classes, right?
Well, I would say
everyone becomes a chode,
males,
in my opinion. Yeah.
Females down. Females, I
Okay.
still think there is a preference to push down. The problem within weightlifting is everyone thinks that they're going to maintain their numbers at a lighter weight class, right? It depends who you're working with. I work with a lot of youth athletes. In that case, my bias is always towards walking
they're developing,
in.
aren't they? Yeah.
Like you're growing up, not just out, right? So for them, we need to be very careful about the messaging around weight class and where they're at. And this isn't your forever weight class as you evolve. When we're working with adults, I think that with your weightlifters, you need to not have them compete too often. And what I mean by that is kind of like we were talking about with the fighters, where you compete on the scale and then you compete in the ring.
Do you think that's different if you have someone who, say for smaller competitions, decides they're going to compete up a weight class? Like, I can't remember how much you would be able to tell me. I always ask Lydia because I always forget the actual weight classes.
She's a great example.
Yeah,
right?
like
she's
told me
competes
often she'll
up.
compete a weight class up, knowing that for her major comp she wants to come down, but she wants actually just the competition. Is that something that you would advocate for?
I love that in my athletes because it means it's so easy to get them down. When I've needed to get Lydia down, it is such a simple process. She cuts on such higher calories than a lot of my other athletes because she's so metabolically happy. She's used to such a high intake. She's healthy. She's not working around a ton of training injuries. And so that would be my question, is looking at an athlete is, okay, what is their body composition like? How much room do we have to move? What's their injury status? If they're battling chronic soft tissue injuries, I'm not going to be advocating to drop down a weight class, right? Because they're just not going to recover. What else is going on in their life? Because for weightlifters, I don't know any full-time weightlifters. Everybody else has a job, right? Are they nurses? Are they working physical jobs? Like, are they super stressed? What are all those other factors? And if they're reasonable, can we push them down?
What about in terms of the performance? Because you mentioned the story before about how this athlete was pretty clear, like, I'm going to compete. Yeah. Right? And from a professional standpoint, you're like, okay, you're damaging your health here. But we spoke before about the divergence of health. How do you personally kind of manage that? And is it something that you're constantly trying to bring them closer towards health? Because I always have this conundrum in my head, and I know I struggle with it, which is careers are only so long. You maximize on that, and sometimes your job is to educate them on maintaining a level of health for the long term. But there are some people who are willing to do things for the short-term gain.
And sometimes it's appropriate.
Well, and that's what I'm saying. Like, it depends on the level you're at. But if someone says, like, I'm going to do this, I know it's pretty dangerous right now, but I'm going to win an Olympic gold medal. Yeah. How do you sort of navigate that? Because I always struggle with this concept. I always push towards health, and sometimes I think I leave some performance on the table. Yeah. Yeah,
and there's going to be the reality that, like, you're probably going to leave some on the table, potentially make an error. But it's so individual. It's what's the level that we're at. I work with CrossFit Games athletes. I work with like worlds and international level weightlifters. If we're talking about an event like that, like of course we're going to maximize it. If we're talking about a young 20-year-old athlete who's just gotten into weightlifting, absolutely not. Like we want to maximize your opportunity for that career. That's probably not where I'm going to grind you into the floor, right? But if we're getting to a high level, and the problem is that's so subjective, right? Because what's a high level, or like what is that limit for me is maybe different. Somebody like going to States for weightlifting, like that could be, for them, that's their everything, and they're going to hang their hat on that for the rest of their life, right? So
again, stupidly, I don't know why I have these thoughts, but I see that, like, for instance, one of the problems that faces the Western world, and particularly I think Australia, because I went to a conference recently, which I don't know whether you went to or you saw, was the like Women in Sport conference, and so much of it was about food and nutrition and, you know, the health effects and things like REDS. And I found it really interesting because as a health practitioner, I also have put my coaching hat on. And sometimes I think like health practitioners are very arrogant about, one, how much influence they have.
Yeah.
But two, there's a lot of like ivory tower bullshit where they're like, I know best and I'm going to do this. And in my head, I kept thinking at times, not the whole way through, you're actually making this athlete worse.
Yeah.
Right? Is it good for their long-term health? Yes. But understand you're actually taking something away from them, which may be potential performance. And I think of like countries where they don't care about that kind of stuff, like Eastern countries, Asian countries, and they'll just grind someone into the ground.
And inject them full of who knows what.
Yes, right. But they're getting performances out that we can't imagine because we're not willing to take those kind of risks.
Yeah.
It's interesting then too, I'd ask the question of the athlete, because if their identity is going to become so strongly associated with their performance, like how much are they willing to actually then push the boundary as well?
Yeah. As I said, but I think like some of this is entrenched in, as Australians, for instance, and I don't know whether you've picked this up coming from Canada, for instance. I think it's probably similar. I feel like Canada and Australia have similar kind of mindset with this, of like, we want to play the game fairly.
Yeah, right? Very much.
And I always laugh because I think it's in many ways it's a little bit naive. And I'm sure, you know, you probably look over the border in somewhere like America. I think they pretend like they play the game fairly, but they do a lot of things that are very questionable. Yeah. Right? And I just think it's an interesting balance because there's certain things that some countries will do and certain athletes will do that will maximize on those things, and it's not good for them, but they want to do it because it's worth the performance at that time. And I just don't know, as practitioners, whether we're comfortable with that. Like, I had this conversation, you know, you mentioned injecting stuff. I had this conversation with the VIS physiologist the other day. We were talking about other countries and all this kind of stuff, and he said, from a general interest point of view as a physiologist, looking at the work of that Dr. Ferrari, like actually reading about what he was doing, he's actually like a brilliant medical physiologist.
It's
like,
it's
just brilliant. Like the understanding that this gentleman has about drug utilization and what effects certain things have and is like insane. He's like, but it's just completely unethical when it comes to the framework of sport.
Well, we've decided that these are the bounds that we play within,
and
that's not fair. And it doesn't take away from how fascinating that science is and how beneficial that might be. And who knows, in the future, might we see some of these supplements become our new creatine and whatnot. But we've decided for now, this is the field to play.
Yeah, and it's an interesting one, like, I didn't think that we'd end up talking about drugs and sport, but I think supplements tends to lead there. The interesting one, and this is a discussion I brought up with him, have you ever seen any of the work of an ethics researcher called Julian Savulescu?
No.
He's Australian, I think, with Romanian heritage or vice versa, I can't remember, but he is a doping ethicist. He often works with WADA and all of those kind of big arbitration for sport kind of, you know, issues, and he talks about this concept that in drugs and sport, there's two primary factors. There's probably many others as well, but one is on fairness, right?
Yeah.
In the context of sport, and the other one is on safety. But interestingly, and it wasn't until I read some of his stuff and it pointed out to me that we actually don't really look about athlete safety when it comes to drugs or supplementation. We just care that they don't have something in their system.
Yeah.
Right? Their kidneys could be shutting down, but no one's testing that.
Yeah.
They're just testing that
That's your
actually there's no steroids or there's no, peptides or whatever it is. And so one of the interesting concepts that I brought up when I was talking with the coach and the physiologist from the VIS about like, if we actually, hypothetically changed what was allowable and it was more about optimizing health, what would that do to sport? So it would mean potentially people are using substances that are currently banned, but they're being watched by, professionals that are trained in managing those things, like medical professionals.
Essentially bringing in like a harm reduction model into
Yes,
sport.
yeah. And it's what's been done in things like harm reduction in drugs and society. Would you actually have better or worse outcomes for long-term health? And what outcomes would you have for performance? Because potentially performance goes up almost at a blanket level, and potentially long-term health potentially is either the same or better, right? I don't know, it could be worse. I don't know enough about the effects of drugs on long-term use and all that kind of stuff.
Obviously got to do with what you take, how much you take and all
that.
Yeah.
So. But I think one of the things that is clear about drug utilization, or at least performance-enhancing drugs, is the biggest issues tend to come from abuse, not from safe utilization working with a medical professional. It tends to be that, the guy down the gym who says take 100 of these tablets, which is, probably way more than you actually need to take to get the performance thing, but then all of a sudden you have cardiac issues.
Well,
and
I'm about to say, the problem is you hear these stories of people whose heart explode when they're, in their late 30s because of drug abuse. Exactly. And it obviously gives it a bad name. But maybe that was a question, made me think of a question, not so much with drug use, but do you see a lot of athletes who over supplement with the idea that that is going to provide them all the nutrients that they need?
I think yes.
Yeah, definitely. Although I will say, again, I think that is getting a little bit better with time. But when I go through my intake assessment with clients and I get through the medical and I get to the supplement part, I'm like, okay, I'm going to work through a list with you. And I want you to let me know if you're taking any of these. I need to preface this is not a list of things that I think you should be taking. It's just what I commonly encounter and what people often say, nope, not taking anything, and then like, dun, 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 they're on it. Because I would get through this list, previously in my consults, some people would be like, oh my gosh, I have so much shopping to do. I was like, no. Like, I don't want you on all this stuff. This is just what I commonly see. Definitely you see over-reliance on, if I'm eating creatine, I don't need to worry about eating like game meat or tons of protein, tons of fish, anything like that. I can just have my WPI. Like, I think it's getting better. I think that there's a better general understanding out there. But I still have a ton of athletes that are, like hopped up on all their pre-workouts and beta-alanine. And it's like, that is the last tiny fraction of a percentage, right?
I don't know enough about the science of the pre-workout stuff. I know that obviously caffeine has a major effect, but the thing that I don't get in the concept is why a lot of athletes take pre-workouts actually for training sessions, often that are not maximal training sessions. That one, like, it's not a question, it's just a stupid statement. It's like, why the fuck would you do that? Yeah. It's like, a sub-maximal session and you're taking pre-workout. Like, that doesn't make any sense to me in the slightest.
Well, I always come back to like, I want you off that. Yeah. I want you off it right away. Not because I'm so opposed to you taking that, although I probably am. Yeah. But it's more so like I want to be able to assess your energy levels relative to your intake. And if you're jacking yourself up on pre-workout, that's going to be very difficult to determine. Right?
Out of curiosity, I know this is something that I've played around with, and I know John has too, and that is consuming organs, and part of that is because of their nutrient density. Like, as I'm sure you're aware, like their nutrient density is off the chart.
Played around. It's part of the diet.
Hey?
It's not playing with it. We're eating
around with it every day.
Well, yes. It's something that I consume on a regular basis. Is that something that you've also tried to integrate into athletes' diets, or even
people do not want to be eating organs?
I don't routinely. Something that I probably should. I feel like that is such like that's one of the big asks. Yeah. Right? Like, let me just build on the basics, and then if you're willing to go there, great, happy for it.
Yeah,
But-
I struggle to get any of the athletes to eat liver. They just won't eat it.
Well, there's obviously easier ways of doing it now too, like the freeze-dry capsule, so you don't actually have to
I know,
consume.
but like it's so easy and cheap and readily available to get, good quality liver that you could just go to the butcher and get it. And it's
I'm
cheap.
with you.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I guess that's the problem where something that you and I are willing to do, it sounds like not many
Like
people
I can
are.
get a whole, grass-fed lamb liver for like $2.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's just, it's such like a mental block for so many people, isn't it?
Do you think that there's actually, and this is a more broad question because I think it brings up something interesting, is in previous generations, eating organ meats was very normal. Right? I think there were socio-cultural reasons, there were socio-economic reasons for that. But a lot of people would, if you ask someone who's 60 and above, have you eaten offal? Have you eaten liver? Have you eaten kidneys? Have you eaten brain? Predominant number of them will say yes.
Yep.
And some of them say, I really like that. I don't eat it that often now, but I really like eating, say, liver or whatever it is. Now we don't eat it, right? Primarily, the majority of people would not eat it. There will be a small percentage that do, right? Maybe in that older population, it's still more common, but in the younger generation, people say below the age of 50, I would say.
Do you think that it's like a little bit to do with potentially like urbanization and getting so far removed from our food sources?
Definitely, yeah, I think so for sure. But do you think we're seeing the ramifications of that, given that it's so nutrient dense and we get so many of these vitamins and cofactors by eating those kind of foods? Do you think that's leading to some of the things that we see in general, not only in athletes, but in the general population?
Deficiencies.
Yeah, and deficiencies and health things that clearly, like say for instance, iron deficiency, right? It seems to be really, really common.
Yeah.
Right? Even though people do seem at a reasonable level to eat animal proteins and meat, right? They still have iron deficiency. And it's pretty clear to me that if you ate liver maybe once a week, that would probably be diminished.
Solve itself.
Yeah. But people don't eat it.
Yeah.
Do you think that we're seeing some of that sort of filtering through over time with more deficiencies than were previously common?
I can definitely see how that would be a factor. I think that generally if we look at like the dietary intake changes over the last like 50 years, right? Talking kind of from the 70s onwards and the shift towards more processed foods and away from that. It's like, I think that has a big factor. I think that even if you look at kind of back 30 years ago when we got really into heart health and really started slamming red meat and cholesterol and things like that, again, you have a lot of people that are willing to eat animal products, but it's predominantly chicken. And so you're seeing a lot less red meat intake. You're seeing a lot less like organ intake. You're seeing a lot more processed food. And I think that's probably all converging to this perfect trifecta.
Well, that brings up two questions, and hopefully we get to both of them. One is on, the diet hard hypothesis really pushed the idea of reducing fat intake. And
Specifically saturated fat.
Yeah, and I know that you brought up before, hormone levels.
Yeah.
It's saddening because it's clear that a lot of people have hormonal disturbances that I think is because they don't eat enough of these, fats, particularly from animal products.
Yeah.
Right? They just they're indoctrinated to think that that's primarily bad for them.
Yeah.
Can you maybe speak to that?
Yeah, I think that I've seen that massively in athletes, and especially when you get into maybe like the more orthorexia side of things, right? Where it's like, I want to eat so lean and so clean and only fish and chicken and
they
things
just eat
like
white fish and chicken breast and that's it.
Yeah, and I'm like, what about your building blocks for your hormones?
Yeah.
Like you need cholesterol, you need saturated fats. These are essential in your diet. Yes, we want to balance them, and we don't want them
eating just foods that are high in cholesterol.
But
Go on.
You cannot build hormones without that, right? So if you want to have a healthy athletic career or just like a healthy lifespan, if your hormones don't work, nothing works. So I'd say that's like, when we talk about that pyramid in terms of macronutrient intake, that's pretty low on that pyramid of things we need to check off.
In terms of what we're going to see, if people are lower on those, what are the things and what are some of the clinical symptoms we might see in, say, a general population, but also in athletes that might be indicating, okay, their hormonal level is a little bit
wonky,
disturbed.
Something's going on here. So I mean, the easy one in women is going to be menstrual irregularities, whether that be that their cycle becomes a little bit more erratic or they start to miss cycles, like that's going to be number one, right? For men and for women, athletic and non, attention, cognitive ability to focus is massive. I'd say that's a huge one. Sleep disturbances is another big one. You get all, if you have someone who's maybe say not an athlete, but they're training at the gym and they're on a decent training program and they're really not getting any training adaptation, is it because they're not able to manufacture a growth hormone?
Yeah.
Because they've got no intake? Like those are some of the things that I would be looking at.
And do you think that sometimes like people go, oh, I just have bad genetics?
Yeah.
I love the genetics
Yeah.
part. It comes out every time someone struggles to put on, say, muscle mass.
I'm like, is it bad genetics or is it the fact that you're nailing your diet Monday through Thursday and then you're going out and you're having a 3-day bender every weekend and depressing your testosterone function? Yeah. Like, there's a million other things that it could be.
I'm glad you say something like that because that seems to be the observation that I've had, but I don't obviously have your expertise.
Yeah, so I see that a lot. But I would say for like the focus, the inability to concentrate, those sort of things, those would be, especially in males, because it might not be so obvious. Those would be some of my big things. Decreased libido, like...
it's funny you say that.
All of that stuff, right?
It's very funny you say that because with the athletes that I coach, I weirdly kind of track, particularly with the boys, how much they talk about girls.
Yeah.
Right? And it's a stupid thing to do, I know, but because obviously girls are a bit different with it. They don't necessarily talk about that stuff, at least not in an open environment. They probably do between themselves. But with the boys are generally much more comfortable talking about, I'm going on a date or I'm doing this. And I always really worry when I'm not hearing anything about that stuff, even though I'm not part of the conversation generally, but like I'm kind of like listening out.
Like peripherally?
Yeah, because if they're not talking about that stuff, I'm kind of thinking, okay, actually, do they have libido issues?
Yeah. Well, that 1,000-mile stare, right? That like kind of just like zoned out, like any of that, good indication. Like to use a personal example, my husband had testicular cancer. And when we went in and we would see the oncologist, like they literally would walk out of the room and be like, I have the wrong file. Because my husband is, 6 foot, 93 kilos, very muscular, like great looking specimen. And they're like, there's no way your testosterone is lower than your wife's. But we always joked about his ADD and his inability to remember and focus and concentrate. And that was the only symptoms of low testosterone that he'd had. It was something that we never bothered to get checked because we didn't think anything of it until we couldn't have kids, right? So they're great indicators, but they're not true across the board. And so you really need to kind of be assessing all of it for everyone.
Speaking of fat intake and seeing some of the changes with typically from the dietary guidelines and as a consequence from eating less red meat, there's been a much higher consumption of omega-6 and that also is problematic in terms, potentially problematic because we're consuming a lot more processed seed oils when we think about, sunflower, safflower, canola oil, soybean oil and so on. I'm not sure if you've heard much about some of the hypotheses associated with increased omega-6 intake on metabolic function and health and it being a strong correlate with a lot of chronic diseases that we see today. Have you heard much about that?
Well, it's a pro-inflammatory modulator, right? So anything that's going to cause that immune system to go into overdrive is going to affect metabolic health and is going to massively affect any sort of chronic illness, most of which are like inflammatory and metabolic in nature. Yeah, it's huge.
Yeah,
right?
like there's an MD over in the States. His name's Chris Knobe, I think. That's Knobbe.
Not like Obi-Wan.
Not related to Obi-Wan, no. And he actually talks a lot about this, and he cites a lot of evidence looking at this correlation between an increase in omega-6 consumption associated with a lot of chronic diseases that we see. And I know that the hypothesis is about that we get a change in the actual cellular membrane, which is a fatty membrane, as you'd be aware, being omega-6 and much more fragile, and it causes a lot of hypertrophy of fat cells until they explode. That creates this massive inflammatory cascade and is associated with metabolic dysfunction. And I also see, is that part of the problem that we see now with this very big change in our fat intake specifically? Because these are very much conditions of modern society. They're not really reflective of human history. In particular, when you think about saturated fat intake would have been so high throughout our whole evolution, even since agriculture because you would consume the whole animal.
And it'll be interesting to see what happens with that in the years moving forward, because when you talk about like omega profiles within our adipose tissue, like when you have a baby, the baby's fat stores are reflective of the mother stores at 3 months gestation, right? So, and from kind of like the 6 months leading into conception to the 3 months gestation, that's what will impact the baby's fat stores. And so, yeah, I think that as we kind of move through time and these dietary patterns change, and that's why nutritional science is so difficult, right?
Yeah. It's one of the biggest problems, like I don't envy the position that you're in at the moment, and I'll ask you a question that might give us hope, but it seems like because of the complexity of these systems, it's really difficult to nail down, one, how to control this stuff, and two, how to actually get good understanding of what's going on, particularly with, you guys have mentioned, and you know much more about it than I do, cofactors and synergistic factors and how they work together and how those things actually lead to health, particularly across populations and genetic groups and lots of different things.
There's no black and white answers.
Yeah.
But the other issue too is nutritional research is, one, very limited, but also there's not a lot being done because there's no one to make money from it. You know, it's not like there's a
no one's gonna
drug
tell
that you
you
can patent and go, great, let's sell it.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing that it shows though too is there's clearly complexity in it, because lots of different diets actually can have very beneficial effects for different population groups.
Well, and when we talk about there's no black and white answers, because every person is so unique, right? And so there can't be one blanket approach for everyone. There's going to be different diets that are beneficial for different people.
Absolutely.
Right?
So based off that, I wanted to ask you, is there on the horizon technologies or sort of certain testing protocols that you think are actually going to be able to give us much better understanding of, say, someone's individual nutritional profile and health, and how we probably don't have it yet, but like how we then will start to get those interactions? Because as I'm sure as a practitioner for you, you're trying to search out these different, like, okay, maybe that blood test isn't what I need, but this type of blood test gives me a little bit more insight. And as you said before, the DEXA gives me a little bit more, like, okay, that gives me this. Are there things coming that you can kind of see that, like, hopefully it's going to give you a better picture to be able to work with people?
I think that definitely on an individual level, there's some really interesting stuff that is coming down the pipes. I think on a population level, like, it's a mess. It's a mess.
What kind of stuff on the individual level is coming?
On an individual level, like,
Genetic.
not everyone has access to that, right? I think genetic testing is super interesting.
Things like I know, like I've actually had my genes tested, and for instance, I've got the MHTFR polymorphism, for instance. So I actually looked a lot into that, going, okay, what does that actually mean? And okay, do I need more of these particular nutrients? But yeah, the problem is, can people actually access that?
And then you talk about nutritional science. Like, I think that one's this is going down a little bit of a path.
Yeah, go for it.
That's a huge one right now. Right? That's probably one of the biggest areas of genetic research when it comes to nutrition. And what we're seeing is 50% of the population has a polymorphism in that gene, right? And so we're saying, okay, well, there's alternate forms of, folate, et cetera, that we should be giving you that are going to be more beneficial. Well, the number one place that kind of crops up is preconception and early pregnancy. And so there's a lot of supplementation being pushed, which has alternate forms, which are not tested for neural tube defects, right? And so it's like now we're starting to push stuff that we don't know if it actually works, but in theory it should work better because you've got this variant, and there's no money in it to test it, so it's not going anywhere. And I think that's a bit of like where we're seeing kind of problems with the individual testing, right? Is you can get information that might be really valuable, but if we're not using it in the appropriate context, we can do more harm than good, right? So genetic testing is interesting because it gives us some pretty cool information, but it's also only the light switch. You've got to turn the light switch on.
It's the issue between genetics and epigenetics, exactly.
So like you've got a predisposition, but that doesn't mean that that's an actuality.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot, to go back to your question coming about, like, I'm really interested in I think there's going to be a lot coming out with like regards to gut microbiome and kind of that gut-brain connection and that the reflection on chronic illness. I got
really, really fascinated a few years ago. An article popped up in New Scientist about the whole area of psychobiotics and like what the connection is and how that works. And they're starting to kind of build. And I was having lots of issues, particularly with disturbances in sleep and all those kind of things. So I started like self-experiment don't recommend
As we
it.
do, yeah.
But I started just eliminating things and seeing what would happen. And I found some interesting things, and so now I kind of stick to those things that I feel good, and I make sure I try and get the nutrients that I need from other things. But what was really interesting is how much influence certain foods have on my affect and you know, my emotional status. And there were certain foods that were real triggers for me. And when I tell people this, because I talk to people like this in the clinic all the time, even patients, and they'll be like, "What the fuck
You
are
are
you
just
talking about?"
yeah.
But then I say to them, "Okay, how do you feel the 2 or 3 days after you've gone on a massive drinking weekend?"
Yeah.
They go, "Oh, like low motivation, you know, like a bit
Flat,
depressed,
yeah.
like crappy." And I was like, "Do you think that you still have alcohol in your system?" And they're like, "No, not really." And it's like, that's the effect I'm talking about. But it happens with other things, you just don't notice them because maybe they're smaller, right? And maybe you haven't consumed, you know, if you've drunk 20 litres of beer, it's the same as you consuming, I don't know what it would be equivalent in food, but it would be a lot.
And if you've got a garbage diet, you're going to feel like garbage. It's going to be really hard to
It's
parse those
amazing.
out, right?
It's amazing though the amount of people that are not willing to consider how diet influences so many components to your health and well-being, including mental factors. But I think the other thing that's interesting too is also realizing that diet is important, but it's not the only factor. Because you know, like there's so many things that influence health and well-being, and like it's quite interesting. I know I've come across some research of looking at, say, gut microbiome and how that's influenced by things like the amount of sunlight that you're exposed to affects your diversity. Spending time outdoors, like getting your hands in the dirt. Like there's all these other components that are non-food related, which I think is also important to remember that diet, although is a very central factor to health and well-being, is not the only factor.
Well, interestingly, like if you talk specifically in kids and that developing gut microbiome, like the number one probably biggest factor is
eating dirt.
Well, it's cesarean versus vaginal birth,
totally,
and then it's breastfeeding versus alternate forms, and then it's do they grow up with pets and do they get in the dirt, and growing up with
and
pets
antibiotic consumption
and being in the dirt can actually have just as significant as effect as the method of delivery and early breastfeeding. And I think that's a really powerful message.
It is.
Especially to new moms who are stressing over things not maybe going the way they wanted.
Yeah,
it's
well,
like
we actually we were talking about this
we
week.
can, there's it's not like a one shot.
No,
right?
but
there's certain hospitals I know now too where this might sound
what, they don't
odd,
clean
but-
anything?
No, well, if you go have a cesarean section, they'll take a vaginal swab from the mother and put it over the baby's mouth
It's-
to actually
vaginal
expose
seeding.
them,
okay.
to actually expose them to
That's
that
intelligent.
microbiome.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that, like, I think the factor that you're bringing up is, as you said, like, although it's central, there's so many factors that
absolutely.
influence these things.
There was going being a bit more focusing on one particular nutrient. One thing I was interested to ask you about is vitamin K2.
Oh, jeez. Okay.
Because
Here we go.
We spoke about this briefly last week. John and I were talking about bone health and metabolism, the importance of K2 for calcium metabolism specifically. Is that a nutrient that you often think about with athletes you work with, and thinking about it, whether they're actually consuming K2 in their diet?
Probably not for the vast majority. Now, whether there's maybe more potential to unlock there. But again, that is like the top end of that pyramid.
Absolutely,
I
yes.
guess my concern with like K2 as well as, is there consistent intake? Because that's the one where it's like I tend to think that the problems that arise, not necessarily just from deficiency, but like wildly varying intake.
Oh, okay.
And it is something that you can see wildly varying intake when people are trying to clean up their diet and eat foods that they perceive to be those top tier foods, right? And you'll see people like, I don't know, randomly like start smashing kale or start, smashing something. And it's like, there's actually some nutrients in there that have pretty massive physiological effects that when we're kind of vacillating them up and down might be important to look at. Now that, like I said, for me, for most of my clients, I'm not getting into that depth with them.
Yeah, you're trying to form the foundation. Don't get too carried away.
I mean, I would love if I had a client that we had ticked every one of those boxes. That it's like that's the level that we can go to.
Well, it's interesting though too, because I noticed that one, it's a nutrient that's often not spoken about, but two, often in the food app diaries that you can put your food intake, it doesn't give you a breakdown of different forms of K, like with K1 and K2 being quite different, having different physiological effects.
Yeah. So, and the micronutrient database is probably don't.
Well, that's the other thing
right?
too. Yeah, there's actually not a lot about it specifically.
Yeah.
Was there anything else that you wanted to talk about, Joe?
No, I feel like we've covered most of the areas I'm interested to talk about.
Is there anything interesting that you want to talk about, whether it's related to sort of performance or injuries or anything like that you think
I don't think there's
maybe we haven't touched on?
Maybe any areas that we haven't touched on. I think that, and we've kind of gone back to it over and over throughout the discussion, it's just that like the importance of individuality and individualization in your assessment and your programming, right? And are you, whatever issues you're seeing, are you individually assessing that client's intake relative to their needs? Because there is no way to blanket approach nutrition.
With that in mind, do you have many experiences where someone's making significant changes to their diet for the better, hopefully, but actually come up with problems because potentially they're introducing food groups that they don't tolerate well? Like, do you find that there is a lot of trial and error sometimes involved to figure out what is the best individual response? Or do you find if you hit the main sort of pillars, they typically have beneficial responses regardless?
I would say, generally speaking, if you're hitting the main pillars, where I see an issue is more so when people are trying to clean up their diet and they end up doing a form of restriction.
Yeah, they remove things that they don't need to. Yeah.
Generally not adding things in that I see a problem with. It is because generally people are going to do quite well and probably have a pretty positive impact to novel nutrient diversity. But it's restriction that causes issues.
Actually, that does bring up a concept. Are there things in your mind that, not that generally, like, and I assume you might suggest, okay, well, it's individual, but are there things that you typically will give to people that most people don't necessarily talk about, or vice versa, things that you would, not restrict, but sort of keep maybe a bit limited because you see that it doesn't necessarily address some of like the, particularly microbiome type stuff or some of those other areas that people maybe aren't seeing the benefits to?
I don't think there's anything massively unique that I do. I've seen changes in my practice over the years in terms of like trends in what I recommend. Probiotics being one of those trends. I used to be very opposed because I'd worked with a lot of SIBO patients and patients that had been made a lot worse by that. And then I've swung back totally the other way recently, just talking about so much gut microbiome stuff.
What about the concept of the prebiotics rather than...
So, and that's where I generally will, unless I've had a client that's had like a recent bout of gastro or something, or they've had some acute change where I'm going to say, okay, like, let's go ahead and get this probiotic started. I'm much more likely to say, here's a list of prebiotic foods and probiotic foods, and I'd like you to include, 3 foods from each list on a daily basis.
What are these kind of foods? Because I'm ignorant.
So like basic stuff like banana, wheat germ, artichoke, things like that.
Stuff that I wouldn't eat.
Stuff that's easy to integrate, right?
Wheat germ. Where do you get wheat germ from?
Isn't a good prebiotic form like resistant starch where, like, say for instance, rice that's cooked and cooled actually creates a lot of resistant stuff, which is a prebiotic? Or you can do the same thing with like potatoes and sweet potatoes and things like that.
Yeah, you can definitely do that. That stuff's so easy to include.
I'm joking.
A wheat germ is like a great little topper to make something crunchy.
I'm never
going
to
to
eat wheat germ.
Oh, come on.
It's disgusting. I'll eat bananas.
Yeah, go for it.
Bananas are great.
So, I mean, those are the things that I would generally say, like, go for that. I don't think that I have anything completely novel or super irregular that I'm going to prescribe. I would say...
Eat grass, John.
Yeah. I would say probably what more people are surprised at when they come to me is more of like a mindset approach to having a day where you're going to have a meal that's off program each week, where you're not thinking about tracking or micronutrient intake or anything. You're just going to go have something that you enjoy, even if that's a processed food or a food that we would see low value in typically.
Yeah, I think that there's a really important factor in that, like with athletes particularly, where they are being very disciplined in lots of areas of their life. If you give them the opportunity, like today, you're on your major rest day or whatever, like you can have a meal where you eat what you like.
Yeah.
Something that you enjoy eating, whether, it might be ice cream, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, like I don't care what it is.
Yeah.
Like go have it, go enjoy it, because I think that mental release is really important. I think the social release is really important. And I think that if you are 100% dialed 100% of the time, we are going to we're going to hit a point where we're either going to have a problem with like some orthorexic behaviors, or we're going to struggle when I need you on program and I need you to be cutting and you can't give me 100% because you feel like you haven't enjoyed yourself.
The only interesting thing actually about eating really healthy, and I think you and I talk about this a lot, Jack, is how bad you feel when you eat like something processed that you shouldn't like. You're like, why did I eat that? You go and eat like cake or something.
And you've got like, a full hangover.
Yeah, you
but
can't.
Also,
you don't sleep
how much
properly.
of that is potentially psychosomatic though too?
I don't know if it is because when I'm eating the cake, I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, it's true.
Right, why don't I do this more often?
Yeah, and then like
next minute
you can't sleep, or like I always have the issue of like if I eat really processed foods, I wake up during the night.
Yeah.
Whereas if I eat generally pretty healthy, I will sleep through.
Yeah.
And so I just like I'll wake up and I'll be like, why did I eat that?
It's true. Like you raise a good point because I'm someone who I'm quite consistent with what I eat, and I figured out what to eat to make me feel good. And I'm similar to John, where perhaps I've become so sensitive where when I have something that I'm not familiar with, I do feel bad for it. And there's always that interesting conundrum because there's one thing of like just relax, you know. You only get to live once, enjoy food. Yeah. But then I also look at it going, well, if I only get to live once, don't I actually want to feel good as much as possible?
Yeah, but everyone likes the taste of ice cream. I know you do.
I'll eat it every now and then, don't worry.
Yeah, so that's probably my biggest thing that people are surprised by.
Mm-hmm. This episode of Lateral Think is brought to you with the support of Strength by Numbers. Strength by Numbers have created an integrated clinical and sports performance system. The AXIT system uses force plates, dynamometry and strain gauges to objectively measure everything from isolated movements to sports performance tasks. The system has greatly enhanced our clinical practice, decision making and objectivity. We are no longer guessing. The greatest thing is its ease of use, both for practitioners and clients. There are no wires, no fixed setup. It is a fully integrated Bluetooth system. If this sounds like something that would enhance your practice, visit strengthbynumbers.com and tell them that Melbourne Athletic Development sent you. Thank you very much for joining us, Katrina.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.